Record. Recording in progress. Okay, so I'll try again. A very warm welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by our Count Me In team, with the people behind turning words into actions. And I'm delighted to tell you that today's webinar is titled Getting Out of the DEIB Echo Chamber, How to Take Everyone on the Inclusion Journey. And I'm delighted that our guests today are Sophie and Danielle Wood, who are a married couple. They've been together over 32 years. Which is incredibly impressive. Their personal journey through Sophie's transition, male to female, has given them unique insights into the challenges that are faced when you feel like you don't belong. Between them, they've over 40 years of experience in the HR world, and they've both led in-house diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging functions in both the public and private sectors. Sophie's previously crafted a career in the L&D space and is also now a Mental Health First Aid England accredited instructor. Danielle is a CIPD qualified people professional with both generalist and specialist experience, and has in recent years also become an ICF accredited coach. Their lived experiences and professional expertise make them uniquely positioned to guide organisations towards greater inclusivity and understanding, which they do through their passion project, Belonging Base. And their passion comes through in a variety of inspirational talks which they deliver together. These cover topics that raise awareness of how belonging is vital to individual, team, and company success, using their lived experience to illustrate the key themes. And their keynote is All Things Trans, Ask Anything. And this is going to be an informal interview facilitated by Danielle with Sophie, exploring the trans experience and giving participants the chance to ask anything they need to help with their awareness. And so, without much further ado, I'll hand you over to them.
Hello and welcome. I'm Danielle Wood, and for clarity, my pronouns are she and her. I am cisgender and I'm proudly pansexual.
And I'm Sophie Wood. My pronouns are also she and her. I'm binary transgender and Danny sexual, as Danielle is my one and only.
Oh, bless you.
So that's the cheese
that's so
quota.
Sweet. Oh, now it's quite probable that we've already used some words that at least one person on this call or anyone listening on the recording will be thinking exactly what does that mean. And we understand that language that's associated with diversity and inclusion can at times be a barrier and end up becoming exclusionary to the majority. So we'd like to help clear that up straight away. And I'm going to say the key one is, let's start with cisgender and transgender. So quickly over to you, Sophie.
Well, quite simply, they're just labels that we attach to our gender identity. So in simple terms, that's our personal and internal sense of a self as male, female, or a combination of both, or neither. So trans and cis are both Latin stem words. Trans means moving from point A to point B, i.e. you're on a journey. And cis means that you're at point A and you stay at point A because no journey is necessary. So does that help you, Danielle?
I think it does, yeah. Clears it up. I am cisgender because I was assigned female at birth and I still identify as female. So I'm not on a journey. I started at point A and I'm staying at point A. Is that right, Sophie?
Absolutely, spot on. Now, most people will not find talking about that simple language triggering in any way, but some people do. So even the mention of diversity, equity, inclusion can divide a room these days. So sadly, I think right-wing politics has weaponized the phrase, weaponized that phrase and other words, such as woke. So there's now a narrative in some way that being woke and supporting diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives are in some way corrupt or dangerous. So if you like, it's like the projection playbook, as I like to call it. And it's important to clarify that we, as Belonging Base, are critical ourselves of some elements of traditional corporate DEI, but we are not remotely agreeing or siding with that pejorative and destructing kind of gaslit narrative that we just mentioned.
Yeah, but that narrative, frustrating as it is, does play a part in why this is now considered divisive. Isn't that right, Sophie?
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, I think there's broadly probably about 4 main things at play. So I think that the term DEIB is currently loaded. So it currently has loads of political associations with it. It's been placed within a culture war framework. It's often misunderstood. And the narrative promotes the idea that the pejorative narrative promotes the idea that DEI is exclusionary for the majority, and indeed disadvantages the majority, especially when it comes to securing a job and moving forward in your career. So there's an assumption that people are getting ahead based on their minority status and not on their merits. So that's point number one. I think number two, I think many companies are pretty guilty of treating diversity, equity, inclusion as like a compliance checklist rather than a necessary culture shift. And that's caused quite a bit of damage. So why is that? Well, because if you turn this into a painted by numbers project, which a lot of people do, you won't actually get the results you might have been expecting. So actually achieving culture shift takes time, effort, and I feel that in the main, that's sadly been lacking for many companies. You've always, as well, my point three, is you've always got the concept of misunderstandings and fear. So you've got people don't want to say the wrong thing, so they get frustrated. They avoid interacting with anyone from a minority group, such as ours, and that in itself creates division. And again, that can damage and have a negative impact on the culture that you're trying to create. And then point four is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts can often feel exclusive to some employees, like they're just not for them. So if you have programs which elevate and celebrate minority groups, it's really important that everyone understands why that is and has the context behind it. Is it because there's an historical disadvantage for that group and you're trying to level the playing field for them? So by explaining and positioning our words in this kind of wider inclusive context, then we can take a better approach that enables everybody to reach their full potential.
Okay, yeah. These are all great points, Sophie. And I know we've been thinking about this for a while. And it's the reason we started Belonging Babes. We wanted to do something that we were both passionate about and something that made a difference to others. And also something that we had a personal experience of. We didn't realise that we had that lovely basic human experience of belonging until we didn't after Sophie came out. We then became aware that without belonging, it can impact on lots of things in your life. But specifically at work, it can affect your mental health, how you turn up at work, how you contribute, how you grow, and it can really knock your confidence. Now, this isn't specific to us. It's not specific to our situation. It's a universal thing. As Sophie said, a lot of diversity and inclusion work has a focus on minority groups. And that's why we're taking a look at it from a different angle, through a different lens, if you like. Now, as we know, no two human beings are the same. We all have our own frame of reference, and we all have our own specific fears, hopes, and dreams based on our unique life experiences. But what we do have in common is the fundamental need to belong. So we start with the end in mind and provide services that support businesses to build more inclusive workplace cultures where people can get that sense of belonging. Now, we recognise that in the current climate, people like us who support and promote DEI are experiencing a backlash. We also know that we have been predominantly speaking in echo chambers, and we want to look at how we get out of those echo chambers. And that's why we're focusing on areas that bring people together through the things that unite us more than the things that divide us. In doing this, you get to bring all the voices to the table. So at the moment, just for clarity in terms of what we do, we focus on 3 key areas. First of all, raising awareness around the importance of inclusion and belonging through our lived experience. We do that through talks and webinars like this one, podcasts and conference speaking. And also we've each got a passion project. Sophie is very involved in mental health first aid training, as often it's the missing piece of the jigsaw to creating truly inclusive cultures, because actually the supportive conversations that happen during mental health instances is instrumental in raising our empathy levels and practicing non-judgmental communication. And for me, it's the Memorable Manager Group Coaching Program. So supporting managers to become more aware of the personal impact they have on team members and to understand how they can leverage psychological safety to build high-performing teams and be memorable for all the right reasons. So Sophie, I know you've been concerned about these echo chambers for a long time now, well, for well over 10 years. Do you want to just shed some light on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm going back to my policing days, back to, 2013. So specifically, it's one of my early events where I did my first kind of public speaking events. So I was at a regional Midlands Police diversity inclusion event in Leicestershire. And at that time, I thought, I know, I'm going to ask the audience why they're here. And I also remember one officer spoke up and informed me that him and his two colleagues were actually attending because they were on a punishment duty. So essentially, they'd committed some kind of issue or infraction in their community, caused some level of offence, and so as a punishment, they were sent on a diversity course to kind of try and correct their behaviour and understanding. Now, at the time, I kind of found that fairly amusing, but it was a real light bulb moment in my head that went off at that time, because I suddenly realised that those are the people I actually needed to be speaking to if we had any hope of actually changing people's hearts and minds towards, trans people in general. So even though the wider audience was there and having a very informative experience, great kind of educational experience for them, but essentially they all really got diversity inclusion, so they were on side already. And it's been an ongoing theme throughout my work in mainstream corporate diversity inclusion. I've been really conscious that I'm always speaking to a minority of people who are really invested, and I'm not speaking to the people who aren't quite so much invested at all. And so I mean, don't get me wrong. It's like we've both taken part in some really excellent initiatives in our diversity inclusion roles, really excellent events to raise awareness around minority groups, such as ours, and the challenges that we face. We've celebrated different races, religions, different nationalities, gender identities, sexual orientations, and some brilliant work has been accomplished in many organisations. However, by their very nature, they resonate highly, as I said, with those interested in diversity, equity, inclusion. And however, the majority of the group that we need to reach out are usually on the outside looking in, or they're actually on the outside and not looking at all. And I believe that's had an impact, and not in a good way, on why diversity inclusion initiatives have kind of varying degrees of success, and why some businesses may not have achieved what they hoped through their investment in diversity, equity, inclusion. So that's where we're coming from.
Yeah, and that's all very well, isn't it? But the question is, how can we flip this and start to bring everyone on the journey towards a workplace culture that does foster that sense of belonging for everybody? How do we step out of those echo chambers?
Yeah, well, I think just as every human being is different, so is every organisation. So just therefore follows there's no one size fits all solution. I mean, it's really important from workplace protections perspective. You get your legally compliant policies and procedures in place to create a solid platform. But it's where do you go from there? And I think it's really important for people who are kind of thinking about embarking on work in this area, not to get overwhelmed by all the things you think you should be doing. So a really good place to start for people is quite simply speak to your people and understand what they mean when they're talking about diversity, equity, and belonging. Because, people's feeling of belonging or not belonging is a very personal thing. So it's really important that we ask those questions. So typically what I've done in the past is create simple surveys and then followed up those surveys, with listening groups to ensure that we're not making any assumptions. So we ask kind of questions like, when do you feel included? When do you not feel included in the workplace? Do you want us to celebrate and elevate certain aspects of your being, any particular characteristics, for example, or are there more simple things that you want us to do that we may not have thought of? So I did this in one of my recent companies that I operated, and it had, I think at the time, it was about 27 different nationalities working together, collaborating on different projects. And from our feedback, the strongest message we received, that whilst we operated in English, the fact that native speakers spoke really fast, they used slang, terms and idioms, they referenced UK-based cultural concepts all the time, and also they never got other people's names right. So the feedback was really strong. That was the most exclusionary thing about our culture. And to be honest, we weren't expecting that. So literally it was kind of 80+% of the company came back and said, we don't feel included because of this situation. Now, all we had to do as an organization in response to that was actually take action. So we encourage everybody to speak slower, to use more simple, easy to understand English in meetings and presentations. We also offer additional support in terms of English language classes. And quite simply, we've got everybody just to put their names phonetically on their email signatures, so that nobody could, sit back on an excuse and, I don't know how to pronounce this name. And all of that hardly cost a thing. There was no kind of, huge financial cost to bringing forward a solution that had a really positive effect on that company culture.
Yeah, I always love that example because I know that it reduced feelings of isolation and actually reduced your turnover. And it does illustrate, doesn't it, that creating a culture of belonging isn't necessarily what you expect it to be. If you want everyone to be feeling that, you need to ask them, how do you know without asking? Listen to what they're saying, learn from the experience, and then act on what your people really want and need.
Absolutely. It's all very straightforward. But there's so much to unpack in all of this and so little time. So we thought it might help if we highlighted 4 key areas for organizations to focus on in order to create their own thriving, inclusive culture where everyone feels like they belong and they can bring the best versions of themselves into the workplace. So to help focus our thoughts and, to be frank, help us remember them, we've come up with our 4 key takeaways. And each one conveniently starts with the letter C. So it's what we like to call the 4 C's of true belonging. So before we share them, I just want to stress it's not an exhaustive list, and they're not specialist skills. They're not specialist siloed D&I super skills. These are just generic key areas of business and human interaction that if we all get them right, we won't just achieve that sense of belonging where people tend to succeed. You'll have this lovely knock-on effect, which will be a more profitable business at the end of the day with a great culture that people can be genuinely proud of. So let's take a dive into this. So Danielle, please, what's our first C?
Well, our first C I'm going to put up on the screen. So give me a thumbs up, Sophie, when you can see it. Brilliant, lovely. So our first C is cost. And do you know what? When we're talking about inclusion and belonging, cost is not one of those things which immediately jumps to mind because it doesn't feel very, I'm trying to think of the right phrase, carey sharey, I guess. But in essence, as I've put here, businesses don't just do things because it's the right thing to do. So, Sophie and I encourage inclusive cultures because we want everyone to feel welcome and safe at work. And, we know that because you're on this session, you're already on board. However, we are realists and we understand that the blockers to success in DEI initiatives can often be money. And businesses want to see bottom line results and a return on their investment. So getting the SLT on side has got to be a priority. And if they think it's just a fluffy, nice to do thing, well, they really need to think again. So we've got oodles and oodles of examples of why this isn't just fluffy. It's really financially savvy. And if you need any help to build your business case, then let us know because we've got them we can let you have. But here are 3 of my favorites. So businesses identified as more diverse and inclusive are 35% more likely to outperform their competitors. Well, if you own a business or you're on the board, what better financial reason could there possibly be? Yeah. Secondly, inclusive teams make better business decisions twice as fast, 87% of the time, with half as many meetings. And they also deliver 60% better results that maximize business performance substantially. Now, when I read that, I thought to myself, wow, what an impact on collaboration, productivity, creativity, innovation, all good stuff. Who can argue with that? And finally, and this is actually one of my favorites, and I think really, really important and something that is being overlooked at the moment, that 63% of employees across all generations said they prioritize diversity and inclusion when it comes to choosing which company to work for. So when you break that down by the different generations, 73% of Gen Z said this. So thinking about the fact that by 2030, around 1/3 of the workplace will be Gen Z or Gen Z. And don't forget Alpha Gen are nipping at their heels. They expect diversity and inclusion as the norm. So if businesses haven't got this right yet, I think they better get a wiggle on, because they're going to struggle to attract great talent moving forward.
Yeah, and I think we, amongst others, have been beating this drum for quite a long time now. But anyway, look, Danielle, that's the bottom line sorted out. What's our number two? What's our second C?
Our number two is, wait for it, connections. So we've said that we all crave belonging, and that feeling depends on how we interact with each other. So what do I want to say about this? Inclusion begins with one fundamental truth. We need those good human connections. And one of the most effective ways that we can do this is through conscious inclusion. Simply put, this is when our intent aligns with behavior, because we often hear about unconscious bias. I've even been on courses myself, and this shows people how deeply ingrained assumptions can shape their behaviors in ways they may not even realize. Now, whilst it is helpful to acknowledge unconscious bias, what if we just flipped the narrative? Instead of only addressing biases, which we may not even notice, let's focus on something we can control, conscious inclusion. Because the truth is, we all have bias, whether it's conscious or not, and it's not inherently bad. It's simply a reflection of our lived experiences, which shape our perspectives on things. So once we accept this, we can shift our default position towards conscious inclusion, choosing to actively engage in thoughtful, inclusive behaviours. Right, Sophie?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we talk about conscious inclusion, it's all about our communication. So I think everybody who's listening to this call would have done some kind of management communication training in the past. And most people understand that effective communication goes beyond words. I think it's research by Albert Mehrabian found that 50% of communication is nonverbal, 38% is vocal in terms of tone, pace, and inflection, and only 7% is actual words spoken. And that highlights an essential truth. So how we say something is just as important as what we say. So again, these aren't specialist siloed D&I skills. These are just generic work-based truths that we're getting into the heart of. So language in this context really does matter. And the words that we choose and the way that we position those words can either empower and welcome, or they can alienate and they can exclude. And whilst intent is important, impact is what ultimately shapes workplace culture. So consider this example. A really simple one. If I introduce myself, as I've done today, as Sophie using she, her pronouns, and someone repeatedly refers to me as he and him, then it sends a clear message. And when done intentionally, it feels like rejection, and it feels insulting, and it feels like I'm not being accepted for who I am. And that's the message that I take away. But when my wife, the lovely Danielle here, occasionally slips up, referring to me as he, whilst recalling a memory from our life before Sophie arrived in our relationship, then that lands differently. She catches herself, she apologizes, and I know her intent is both loving and supportive. And there's no malice present in that communication, just human imperfection. So the difference is intent. Danielle's kindness leaves room for correction and connection. And that illustrates that even when mistakes are made, conscious inclusion creates space for growth for both parties. So how can we start to actually get this right in practical terms? So in simple terms, it's we just need to practice conscious inclusion in all forms of communication. Now that can be written language, so the language we use in our policies, procedures, recruitment adverts, job description, and press releases, or giving consideration to our verbal language. So in training sessions, one-to-ones, team meetings, or one company that we had touchdowns, those kind of little 10-minute catch-ups. So all of those meetings, just if we were all really focused on being consciously inclusive in the language that we use, then that is going to kind of set the tone for the outcomes of those interactions. And if you're not really sure about what successful inclusion looks like in those interactions, then just be curious, be polite, ask, learn, and act. So where we go. So what's the third C, Danielle?
Well, the third C is a biggie. The third C is culture. And culture doesn't magically happen just because you put a set of values on the wall. Culture is built by living and breathing those values and using them as a compass, if you like. So the real challenge here is to get value-aligned behaviours to filter through every layer of the organisation. Because if they don't, they just become meaningless words on the wall. So a perfect example of this comes from a global company I worked for. And they employed over 25,000 people. And each year they ran an employee engagement survey. And the results varied widely. And scores ranged from 45% to 95%. So we had to ask the question, why the huge difference, especially when the whole organisation has the same company values? And it boiled down to one thing. The experience of employees depended really heavily on their local management. So the day-to-day reality of a team wasn't shaped by high-level mission statements, but by the behaviour of the people leading that team. And this leads me very nicely to my quote on the slide, which is about workplace culture. And it's a quote from John Amici, which is, "Culture is defined by the worst behaviour tolerated." Now, if you think about that for a moment, I'll give you an example. So if you have a team and they like to have a bit of a laugh, but sometimes their language crosses the line. Sometimes they target someone in the team and use something which is about their personal characteristics in a derogatory way, and that causes them offence. Now, if the manager joins in and laughs along, it sends a definite message. It says, it's okay to behave inappropriately around here. And when poor behaviour goes unchallenged, it sets the tone for what's acceptable. It shapes a culture based on the worst behaviour. Now, you might be asking yourself, why does that matter? Now, the real reason I think here is that we know that when people don't feel safe, they tend to keep their heads down. So how many voices stay silent in meetings for fear of judgment or ridicule? And how many times have you done that yourself? How many ideas and opportunities then get lost because people don't feel comfortable speaking up? And you don't just have to take my word for it. We've looked into this, and Google conducted research around this through Project Aristotle. And they found that teams with high psychological safety, that is to say, they don't fear judgment or ridicule, are 12 times more likely to leverage diverse ideas and innovate. And that is going to keep your company cutting edge, isn't it? Without a doubt. So whilst legislation and policies are important, they don't create culture. Behaviour does. And according to experts that in the field of psychological safety, when people feel safe, they will engage more, they'll contribute more, they'll challenge outdated thinking, and all of this unlocks the power of diverse perspectives and increased innovation. Now, it doesn't happen overnight, but with every small intentional action, every time a manager acts as a role model or steps in to align behaviour with values, it creates a ripple effect. And over time, these moments add up to shape the broader culture of the organisation. So, Sophie, what's the fourth and final C?
Well, our fourth C is quite topical at the moment, to be fair, and it's conflicting differences. So we accept there are always going to be times when people in our organisations clash. And so typically, your HR people team, your people managers, your leaders often have to balance competing rights. So you're talking about things competing against each other, like the freedom of expression, freedom for religious belief, and anti-discrimination laws. And getting it wrong can be costly, both financially and reputationally. So clear policies can protect everyone whilst ensuring no one's fundamental rights are compromised. And on top of that, if you do use your values as your moral compass, then they should guide you on how you should behave in these situations. And it should be your company values that finally arbitrate quite a lot of these conflicts. So here's what we suggest you do. So promote inclusive values, model inclusive behaviors, and use consciously inclusive language to foster understanding between people. So in doing so, people will understand the importance placed on creating and sustaining a workplace where everyone's identity is respected. So conflicts are minimized through a shared understanding of what inclusion actually means. On top of that, it's important to understand the scope of protected characteristics that fall under, for example, in the UK, the Equality Act 2010. So make sure people feel fully supported and their rights are upheld without one group infringing upon the rights of another. And if in doubt, sometimes legal advice may be necessary, especially when the conflict involves balancing competing rights. So this is where a lot of companies are starting to struggle and will continue to struggle in this area. So then create policies that outline acceptable workplace behavior and define the line between belief and actions that affect others in the workplace. So we need to make it clear that personal beliefs do not excuse discriminatory behavior. So including, for example, using correct pronouns, avoiding harassing people. So, fairly recent case law in the UK found that holding a gender critical belief is protected under the belief element of the Equality Act 2010. So somebody can, be protected in holding that belief. And there should be no issue with that belief being held and represented outside of the workplace. However, to act on that belief to the detriment of trans and non-binary individuals within the workplace would be a breach of legislation. So a supportive policy in this respect can clarify this for all employees. So everybody understands the terms of engagement. When we do have these clashes, it's always better to try mediation first to resolve things. Goes without saying. So having open dialogue and mediation between parties involved should always be encouraged. So focus on the effect of the behavior in terms of how it actually made someone feel, because often conflicts come from misunderstandings or lack of education about the other person's perspective. So a constructive conversation led by somebody from HR people team or a leader within the organization or a strong empathetic manager can help both parties quite often feel heard whilst being able to find some kind of common ground. So consider also whether reasonable accommodations can be made without compromising the dignity or rights of others. For example, if an employee objects to using certain pronouns for religious reasons, you might find a neutral workaround, such as just by using the person's name instead. So that's just a few suggestions there. So I hope that gives everyone a few starting points to navigate this complex space of competing rights, using a balanced approach rooted in respect and lawful compliance, and living the behaviors that underpin your company values is absolutely key. Danielle.
Thank you, Sophie. So, in summary, cost, our 4 C's. Cost, remember it's about the countless benefits financially and reputationally, and being future-proof for Gen Z and Alpha Gen. And then it's connections. Let's work on making those human-to-human connections by practicing conscious inclusion, rather than getting overwhelmed by everything we think we need to know and do. Culture, it's about those intentional actions, however small, as each one has a ripple effect. And be proactive in empowering people to call out behaviour that doesn't align with your values. As I said, culture is defined by the worst behaviour tolerated. And conflicting differences. Know what to do when differences collide. Use your values to guide you and your policies for practical guidance. If you've embedded inclusion in your culture, you've got a fantastic base to start from. Have those open conversations with the parties involved to try and raise mutual awareness and understanding, and try and broker a solution amicably, human to human. And so remember, that to take everybody on the journey, you would need to give a great experience to everyone. Quite often, despite companies having great intentions, these intentions don't cascade down through the whole organization. And we believe this is an overlooked area. And the key to shifting the dial on inclusive cultures, where everyone wants to be involved, is to get those people managers upskilled to give each team member the chance to flourish. It will, without doubt, reap rewards. And then you will be stepping out of that echo chamber as everybody will want to be on board.
Brilliant. Thanks, Danielle. So, look, all that's left for me to say on this now is to thank all of you who've turned up today, and thanks to all of those who've chosen to listen to this event. So now's the time, if anybody's got any questions or anybody wants to discuss any of the themes that we've brought into the room further, then now is the time.
Adrian.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a question. I didn't want to leap in on our own webinar, but can I just ask you both, in terms of the kind of recent backlash against various acronyms, including DEIB and ESG, how optimistic you are about fighting the good fight with regard to companies saying, you know, well, we no longer wish to be engaged in these conversations. We want to concentrate on other areas. Are you still optimistic? I think are there reasons still to be, you know, broadly in favour of carrying on the fight?
Do you want to pick that one up, Sophie, or shall I?
You do that one.
Oh, okay. I think there, over the past few weeks, and particularly for our own personal situation with regards to the whole trans narrative that's going on at the moment, there have been really dark moments where we thought, you know, everything seems to be rolling backwards down a hill. It's like you're trying to stop the boulder going backwards after so much good progress has been made. Now, I think the media portrays that the tide is turning in that direction. However, I mean, something that has made me feel optimistic, I think, over the last couple of weeks is that we've seen several countries in the world re-electing their leaders. So we've had in Canada, in Australia, in Romania, they all looked like they were going to be going down the route of their right-wing leaders in the elections. And actually, what I call the Trump effect has actually meant that they've swung back in the opposite direction. So I think people do take notice and watch what's going on in America, and therefore you have these people now who are kind of thinking, well, hold on a second, that's not what we want. That's not we're coming back in the opposite direction. Now, this is going to be an ongoing issue. There are going to be companies that roll back. And I think we have to accept that you aren't going to get 100% agreement on anything ever. There are always going to be people who understand and agree and know why we want to have more inclusion in the workplace, so that we give opportunities to absolutely everybody. But there are going to be people who that they're never going to change their mind on this. And maybe this is actually bringing out of the shadows the knowledge that who was pinkwashing, let's say, who was pinkwashing, who is actually dedicated to inclusion and who isn't. Because we saw very quickly after the guidance on the Supreme Court ruling about wasn't about bathrooms, but you know, that's what everyone's focusing on. We saw the EHRC come out and make a statement on that, very rushed. And straight off the back of it, Barclays Bank decides they're going to roll back their diversity initiatives and actually make it difficult for their employees. They've gone out there, they've employed people from the trans community, and they've said they're safe there. And then now all of a sudden, they're no longer safe there. So there are going to be companies who show their true colours. I mean, I think it would be insulting if Barclays went out there this year and put their pride flags up, to be honest. And, you know, we've seen the BTP, the British Transport Police, say that they're rolling back some of their protections in terms of they're now going to have male police officers searching trans women. So there are companies and organisations, both public and private sector, who have kind of almost used it as a kind of, well, we don't have to do this anymore. We don't have to be committed to this. But that will help people decide where they want to work. And as I said, the really important point here, I think, is that the younger generations coming through are going to demand this more. So therefore, some of these companies might start to become extinct. You know, people will vote with their feet. You know, I bank with Barclays, and I'm looking at how I can transfer my money to somewhere else now. I've been with them for 40 years, and I'm absolutely appalled at what they're doing. So I will walk with my feet. There may be lots of other people who do the same, and therefore, you know, will these businesses survive in the future?
Might be a up. So it's an interesting take, Danielle. I think if I'm kind of looking about where hope lies, you know, set against this kind of contrast of lots of negative noise around the wider remit of diversity, equity, inclusion, more specifically to our experience and others, that changes to the Equality Act in terms of definition pertaining to biological sex. I think with that backdrop, and a lot of it is noise, and negative noise, and it's been prevalent throughout social media, through mainstream media, through our, you know, political leaders, both predominantly in the UK and the US. The single point of hope for me is reality, because at the end of the day, any kind of proposed changes to the way people support their employees is going to hit that word. It's going to hit reality. And very quickly, as most, I think, states in the US are experiencing, when you start to try and solve a problem that doesn't exist, you actually end up creating multiple problems that now do exist. And that will become reality very quickly. And I think it's that reality which will hopefully kind of engage, I hope, you know, wider public interest and public opinion, because the kind of things that are happening to minorities such as ours at the moment can only happen because, generally speaking, people just generally don't care. You know, politicians see us as a safe space to attack because, you know, we don't have a large block vote that could affect their, you know, future prospects. You know, the wider society, both in the US and in the UK, are just hearing constant negativity, probably since, I think, 2015 onwards, you know, if you talk about UK mainstream media. And so that's people's general kind of messaging that they've received around, you know, trans people over the last few years. So the general public attitude is kind of, you know, from general indifference to a general, well, you know, it doesn't affect me, and you know, hear loads of negative stuff about them anyway, so they probably deserve what they get. You know, so some ignorance is well, a lot of ignorance, as we know, is willful amongst, you know, large portions of the population. But yeah, I think, you know, reality is where I pin my hope at the moment, because it's actually a farcical situation in terms of how to police this, and the kind of noise is not helping at the moment. So you take the guidance, which has just been kind of brought out on the back of the legal ruling. And the first thing companies need to understand, speaking to your question from inclusion included, is, you know, companies are generally worried now about, can I support trans people in the workplace without breaking the law and getting myself into hot water? And if you listen to the government's supposed advice at the moment, you would suspect that that's not a possibility. So the first thing everyone needs to understand is what's been issued is not lawful guidance. There is no lawful guidance around this at the moment. If you actually look at the ruling itself, then it doesn't say you must exclude trans people from single-sex spaces at all. What it does say is that if you chose to do that, you would actually have a legal right to do so. And that's very different from mandating that all people should exclude, trans and non-binary people from single-sex spaces. So when we talk about kind of, writing, clear policies, it's important that people understand, what is actually happening, and not react to the noise, and the media narrative around what's happening. So I think the best thing companies can do is watch this space at the moment, because judicial reviews are being brought out against the Equalities Committee. They themselves have extended their consultation time for whatever probably nefarious and spurious reasons for doing so. I've no doubt. And then we've actually got the decision itself is going to be challenged in the European Court of Human Rights. So I don't think it's the end of the road for trans people in the workplace. I think the practical, no, just when you start to think about the practical kind of policing of kind of single-sex spaces, already you can see that it encourages kind of, vigilantism amongst people who are usually kind of, I'd put in the willfully ignorant pile. But actually just think about how law enforcement and, is actually kind of, the state of law enforcement in the UK at the moment. It's, the police service themselves, they don't even respond to, burglaries at the moment. So the fact that there's an expectation that this may be kind of formally policed within the law is ridiculous. And then are you expecting, bouncers at clubs to kind of enforce this? Are we, expecting people to be standing outside the toilets in the local cafe? Your local Wetherspoons, English heritage home that people are visiting. So reality is going to bite, I think. That's where my hope lies. It might be proved to be wrong, and human society, UK society, might continue to floor me and disappoint me. But I really think that that dose of reality hitting will make a difference. And that's the very slim hope that I'm clinging on to at the moment. So I hope that answers your question, Adrian. I don't know whether that spoke to your question from inclusion included as well.
I think that covers a wide spectrum of questions entirely. And I like your idea of reality being the answer. I think for a lot of people, actually, kindness, reality, just common sense, as well as your 4 C's of true belonging, are actually the real narrative behind what will carry things forward. What won't carry things forward, in my view, is just another rainbow-covered donut day, or the equivalent, which I think is probably what a lot of people find harder to stomach. But I think if there were more conversations like this around, the true reasons for implementing these things, then the world would be a happier place with regard to DEIB. So yeah, thank you. I think it's a great answer. I think we've got time for one more question, because I think you've covered the the question from Kelly, inclusion included. So have we got maybe something from our other 2 guests, because they've been very patient, I think we might say.
Can I ask, following Sophie's answer there, I think a lot of the challenges that we're seeing at the moment come from a serious disconnect between what the media is portraying things as and as you use the word, Sophie, the reality on the ground, and I mean my personal experience of the reality is actually at a practical level. Everything is pretty much as it was, and most people, as you know, throughout your presentation, you know, most people treat humans as humans. But we have a media, particularly, I think, a media in the UK, who are hell bent on finding someone to blame and finding something to be outraged at. You've seen it with Brexit. Everything was the fault of the European Union. You've seen it with immigration. Everything is the fault of immigrants. And obviously, at the moment, the narrative is everything is the fault of DEI, and in particular, they've chosen to single out trans people as the latest scapegoat. And I think, yeah, the question I ask is how do we fundamentally change the media narrative? That in fact what you're doing by creating this culture of outrage and blame is you're actually creating an underlying culture which is detrimental to society as a whole. I think it's now I'm going to give you an opinion and then I'll shut up. But I think it's no accident that the UK is the least productive country in Europe. You look at the figures around stress in the workplace. A recent study stated that 91% of the working population, which is pretty much everyone, is suffering from stress. You've got 1 in 5 people burnt out. Now, this way of working. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that come into that, but I have to think a societal culture that is focused on blame and victimization of particular groups of society is leading to an underlying work ethos that is actually detrimental to the success of all businesses. Sorry, it's a bit philosophical.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely spot on there, and I think we've seen in recent years rising levels, should I say, of people suffering with mental health issues because you know, people I think when they talk about mental health, they don't necessarily talk about it in a very positive way, but we all have mental health. And you know, sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad, and there is a rising level, and a lot of this links back to the workplace culture. You know, it's one of the reasons that Sophie wanted to be a mental health first aider and then trained to be an instructor, because you know, the empathy and the non-judgmental listening and really connecting with each other and helping and supporting each other is kind of like the environment that I would rather work in than kind of like a carrot and stick environment. And you know, that is seen quite often as unnecessarily and fluffy. But in actual fact, as you've just mentioned, those levels will lead to increased sickness absence.
Yeah.
You know, in terms, again, it has another impact on the bottom line. And I think people need to be thinking more about how they can make sure that everybody is not only turning up to work and feeling like they're involved and they belong, but also that their mental health is good as well.
Yeah, but if I was going to link the kind of state of the nation's mental health in the UK, and I think living under UK media is a big contributor to the lowering of the level of people's mental health. And I think in a way, if I compare the UK and the US, I find the UK culture is a lot more insidious. So even though things are kind of more in your face and brash in terms of what's unfolding in the USA, what they have is actually a written constitution, which is a kind of almost like a standard bearing, you know, thing that people can gather around and actually viscerally challenge the narrative of what's going on. And so that has led to independent kind of news outlets are kind of springing up and challenging the mainstream media narratives over there. But you don't have that in the UK. There is no written constitution in the UK. And we've kind of it's almost like sleptwalked into this kind of revolving door scenario between mainstream media in particular and politicians to the extent that it's almost like the whole country is just constantly being gaslit, and there's creating this constant dissonance with what people's reality of life is, as we've been discussing, is completely different to what everybody is telling them it is. And that constant kind of jarring and dissonance is really different. It's really having an impact, I think, on everybody's mental health. How we combat that in the media is a really difficult question to answer. I'm not aware of any particular kind of media entities that are springing up in the UK to challenge, current narratives. I suspect it will take something really kind of momentous and bad to happen for people to actually kind of wake up and actually challenge the current state of media in the UK, which is, I mean, I just don't, I can't watch it anymore. I don't engage with UK media at all at the moment. When I moved out here, just to give you a sense of how things deteriorated, so from digressing, so I thought, well, okay, I'm a balanced person, so I understand people have different political perspectives. So here what I'll do is I will have a subscription to the Times and I'll have a subscription to the Guardian, and by doing that, I'll kind of get to compete in different views and perspectives, and I'll get a kind of balanced view of what's happening back in the home country. And it's just like, the Times was the first one to get deinstalled from, all of my devices because it was just so oppressive and horrific, their kind of narrative around things like diversity inclusion, particularly trans people. And I've stuck it out just through, I don't know what, but the Guardian is just as worse as the Times, really, if not worse, in terms of its kind of, and I describe the Guardian's kind of trans narrative as being really insidious. And so that's gone now as well. So now I'm just completely disconnected with UK media, which is a privilege that I have because I'm not living in the UK. But if I had to return to the UK for any reason, then that's going to have a huge impact on my mental health. So I'm out of time and I've been told to wrap it up. So
Thank you for the answer.
We could talk for a long time about the media, and one thing that is always apparent in my mind, Sophie, is that it's all about sound bites. It's not about news a lot of the time, because unless you've got something that sells, people's interest, their time, their money, whatever else, people won't come to you. So you've got to kind of do extreme stuff. But I think ignoring it is probably the way forward, and just delivering your own narrative is certainly the way forward. But we're out of time. It's 1:03. I think that's a 1 hour recording, so we can call ourselves, very accurate in terms of what we've done. And Sophie and Danielle, that was a really super session. I hope the recording will fly off the shelves as well. And I think, like I intimated earlier, just in terms of your own humanity, your own understanding of everything, you're a real lesson to everybody in terms of why we should be thinking more about belonging in particular. Thank you to our guests. I think we're all still here. Harriet, Isabel and Kelly as well. We are a perfect team here this afternoon. If you'd like to hear more from Sophie and from Danielle and also from Kelly, who's been on the call, our physical conference, Count Me In, is in London on the 18th of June. So really very close now. Lots of exciting speakers as well. We are at Bird and Bird in the City of London for the day. So that'll be really interesting. And we'll also have our Gibraltar conference on the 9th of September at PwC. So lots more to look forward to in terms of conferences. And Danielle would never forgive me if I didn't tell you that we've got more webinars coming up with Gen Z, I think it is, next month. And yeah, I know, how exciting is that? People who are younger than us, maybe. Impossible. So thanks. Sophie and Danielle, anything you'd just like to say before we sign off?
I'd just like to say thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Super. We'll see you back again soon. And thanks everybody else. Have a lovely afternoon. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.